Now, you mentioned parental alienation earlier because your wife accused you of alienating your daughters from your ex-wife. Is that correct?
Yeah, so what happened, so they were living with my ex-wife when we first split up because I was just conscious that as a man, I might not fare very well in the family courts, and that my ex-wife is very articulate, she's very middle class, she can put on a good front. So, but then as my daughters lived with her, the emotional bullying of my daughters was getting really bad. I met the lady who's now my wife, a very measured and wonderful woman. And then it got really bad. That my ex-wife then did not like the girls coming to see us. So in the end, she said that she made these claims that I was about to kidnap my own daughters. I don't know where I was supposed to be taking them or how this kidnap plan was supposed to unfold. But I then wasn't allowed to see them for 3 or 4 months while it rolled through court. And then the courts, basically, it backfired on her because we had a good Kafkas officer, not everybody does, who was quite insightful. And she saw the bullying that was going on. So the girls were moved up to Birmingham with me. And but about 3 or 4 years later, my youngest daughter, who carried on having contact with her mum, decided it was just too stressful for her and she didn't want to see her anymore. So stopped seeing her. It was very hard to get her to attend contact. But of course, my ex-wife claimed that it was my fault. I was manipulating and the decision now needed to be reversed. So I had to go back to court and sort of prove my innocence that I'm not an alienating parent and that my daughters had legitimate reasons for not wanting contact with their mum. And it was hard, there's, on the one hand, you want to fight against parental alienation, but that could mean that children are forced into contact with abusive parents. Or on the other hand, you want to ensure that loving parents aren't squeezed out of their children's lives by manipulative parents. And that's why when we talk about parental alienation, it's a very divisive subject. A lot of women's groups, particularly now, are kicking back against parental alienation, particularly Women's Aid, for example, arguing that it's playing into the hands of abusive men. But then there's plenty of groups saying, look, it's never been any better. It's still really bad for dads, particularly, being squeezed out of their kids' lives. So how you approach that dilemma of protecting children so that loving parents are not squeezed out of their lives, and so that also in cases where there are abusive parents, they're not forced into contact with them, that's quite difficult for family courts because they get such little time to spend on each case. How are they going to make correct decisions? And there's no deterrent for people lying in the family courts. You can lie in the family courts, and even if it's absolutely clear, even if it can be proven that you are lying in the family courts, you won't get penalised or sent to prison for perjury or anything like that. So because parents can get away with it, they've not got a lot to lose, they do. And so the family courts are a mess, and it's agonising seeing men, particularly men, going through that. But listen, some women get a rough ride in court as well.
Sorry, I was just going to say that you were talking about how you don't want to be a hypocrite where you alienate your ex-wife from her children, but you also support the people who feel alienated. You don't want to essentially do to your ex-wife the kinds of things that you complain about happening in family courts. And I totally get that. I totally understand. Although when somebody is being abusive, that's exactly what is necessary for the safety of the children, because the children have to come first. And what I always say to people who find themselves in a similar dilemma, where their personal situation, the help that they need to get goes against, in theory, the political stance that they support, is I say that it's not hypocritical to cry wolf if there actually is a wolf.
Yeah. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. The difficulty comes to proving it. So with my daughters who legitimately found it too stressful, we had in that second family court battle a Kafkas officer who basically was just black and white. And I think that's where it's difficult in the family courts. She took the view, well, listen, they've got to see mum, and that is that. And if they're not, it will have to be the dad's fault. and we must force them to see mum, even though they were 12 and 15. So how you force a 12 and 15-year-old to do anything is beyond me. But it is a challenge. And also, how do you, as a dad, let's imagine you're the non-resident parent, your ex-wife has been abusive towards you and is playing havoc with your contact. What about when your kids are asking you, well, why can't we see you more? If you say, well, mummy's not letting you see me more, that's alienating language. You're not supposed to say that. But there comes a time where kids, they don't want politician-style answers anymore. They want direct answers to your questions. So trying to parent neutrally when the other parent is abusive is really, really hard. And so that's where, for me, I don't think parental alienation, it can be a black or white thing. But what I will say about parental alienation in supporting men and standing up for men as we do, and what we've kind of been talking about today, is that it is domestic abuse and parental alienation will go hand in hand. You know, if a guy has suffered domestic abuse with a female partner and he has kids with that female partner, when that relationship is over, then parental alienation will then be the next thing that follows. As clear as night follows day, parental alienation follows domestic abuse. It's just, you know, because the abuser has lost control of their victim now. So what they do have control over is the kids, and they can wage warfare psychologically, and they do. And so when we talk about domestic abuse and parents, you know, parental alienation needs to be talked about as well. And certainly in terms of the domestic abuse bill, we need to make provision for parental alienation. What are we going to do about it?
Did you read in the guidance of the domestic abuse bill that parental alienation is mentioned, but it's actually misrepresented? So it is when they mentioned parental alienation, but they pretty much put it as if it was false allegations by fathers against mothers. That's how it was portrayed. So very, very sneaky how the women's organizations even tried to coercively manipulate that.
It's an absolute disgrace. And what they should have had in the domestic abuse bill is some kind of independent research inquiry project that looks at how you solve this dilemma of protecting loving parents from being squeezed out of a child's life, whilst also preventing children being forced into contact with abusive parents. What can be put in place at court to ensure that both of those scenarios don't happen? There has to be a way, or we have to get better at preventing both cases from happening. And the courts are very messy, they're very clumsy. I mean, even the parenting workshop, it's a bit of a tick box exercise that if you're in a really acrimonious court case, you'll be sent on the Kafka's parenting workshop. Now, having been sent on it, because I was in an acrimonious case, the Kafka's workshop, to be fair, and as a trainer, it's pretty good. It's not a bad workshop if your children are under 6. It's a great workshop. But if your children are like 9 or 10 or older, the workshop is utterly useless and pointless and just a tick box exercise. So again, how can the family courts create a different kind of workshop? This is where we need to be going. This is a conversation we need to be having, rather than arguing that parental alienation does or doesn't exist.
I had a look at the domestic abuse guidance, and I looked into all the documents that were quoted for the guidance, and there was maybe a fourth of them are neutral, just like the ONS statistics, so just neutral statistics, and all the other documents are gendered, either exclusively looking at women's experiences or looking at women like domestic abuse through a gendered lens. There was only one document that looked at the experiences of men. One document out of, I would say, roughly 70. And unless all the research is being done by organizations like Women's Aid, unfortunately. They get the money from the government. They do the research. The research only looks at female experiences, and that makes its way into legislation. So unless there is a rule, a law that says all research needs to be balanced, it won't change,
No,
unfortunately.
it won't. And obviously, if you look at women's aid capacity versus mankind initiative capacity, you're talking about two very different organisations. Your Mankind do an incredible job on a shoestring budget. Women's Aid, very well oiled. They've got tons and tons of staff and funding. So of course they've got time to put full-time researchers on this in a way that the men's groups don't have, because I look at a lot of the men operating kind of in this space trying to support male victims of domestic abuse. For the most part, it's voluntary. You've got day jobs, you've got kids, you just try and squeeze in what you can in the evening, whereas Women's Aid will have full-time permanent researchers working on it. And so it's a very unequal playing field, leading to some very unequal data that is not balanced in any way.
I have the feeling that women that experience domestic abuse connect with other women that experience domestic abuse, where men that experience domestic abuse just want to move on and want to live a new life and get out of it. Is that a fair assessment? Is that one of the reasons why there is no movement?
I mean, that's a very good observation. I mean, I completely agree with you. And of course, we've got to be careful not to generalize. There are plenty of women that move on. Hey, listen, some of our most passionate advocates are women who have been abused by men, and they are huge. But I do think it's an observation that a lot of the men just want to move on, put it behind them, and just learn from their mistakes. Whereas I do feel that a lot of women that I see who have been victims of domestic abuse can get caught up in being really injured for years and years. And I guess a women's advocate might say that's because women feel it more, but I think that's nonsense. But I do think, I think men perhaps move on and put it behind them more quickly. I don't know why that would be the case, but
I've got a theory, and maybe you want to say something to that as well if you have an opinion on it. I think that victimhood is an embarrassment to men and makes them less attractive, where victimhood in women actually gives them some kind of social status within a victim group. I'm not saying that's it's not an attack against women or men, obviously. I just think that when you have a woman that needs help, society helps. When you see a man that needs help, women often society often reacts with disgust or with laughing at the man. Your male status goes down if something like that happened to you. I think your status as a woman stays the same or even goes up for a while within the domestic abuse circles. Pat, what do you think about that?
I think that you're right, and I think that it plays into our genetic history. I think that men have always been encouraged to be self-sacrificing, to be protectors and providers, and ultimately to be disposable. So a man who is particularly interested in self-preservation is not particularly useful to society. I think that women are a barometer for how society is doing, particularly for children. Women are there to say this environment is not suitable, this environment is dangerous, this environment's too cold, this environment will not be fitting for a family. And so people take heed when a woman complains about something, because we know that they are A, physically more vulnerable, B, they need to be in good health in order to produce children, and C, they're also there to make sure that the environment is suitable for children before children can say it themselves. I do believe this is why, for example, women are more sensitive to the cold than men are, because they do measure it for children.
So practically, when women complain, it's important for society. When men complain, it's a weakness for society.
Yes, it's a liability. Too many men complaining is a liability, because when the army is at the gates, you can't have men who are overly sensitive. Whereas women complaining is a usefulness, because we need to ensure that they are healthy so that primarily the children are healthy.
But times have changed, society has changed, and
But we are still beholden to our genetic ancestry that's 5 million years old.
Absolutely, but I would say that at the moment, if men don't start to speak up and actually look after themselves, it will be very dangerous for society, because it creates an imbalance in society, which will be bad both for men and women.
I agree. It reminds me of Karen Strawn said this idea that if you call a man a girl, or if a man is acting particularly feminine and you bully him, feminists would say, oh, that's because clearly you have a problem with women. But she said that no, it's not, because you don't complain about girls behaving that way. You complain about a boy behaving that way because you're worried that he is assuming too much for himself, that if he starts acting feminine, then he might start expecting the feminine privileges. He might start expecting to be protected and be provided for. So it's very important to nip that in the bud. At least Karen's theory was, we don't punish boys for acting feminine because we hate femininity. We punish it because we need men to be masculine and never assume that they can get away with being feminine.